Our special guest today is Dr. Arvind Singhal. He is the Samuel, Shirley, and Edna Holt Marston Endowed Professor of Communication at the University of Texas at El Paso. He is also the Director of the Social Justice Initiative at the university. Dr. Singhal is here at Campbell through Friday for the Communication Studies Week. He has co-authored and edited 14 books on communication topics. The topics include things like social change, AIDS in Africa, and positive deviance. Dr. Singhal, thank you for joining us today on Campbell Now.
My pleasure, Madison.
I'm so happy to have you here. So I know that we've mentioned that you do a lot of research on things like positive deviance. Can you define positive deviance to us?
Certainly. So a deviance is typically understood as being something negative, something bad. And in this case, as the phrase implies, we are talking about the good kind of deviance. So positive deviance is really a problem-solving approach where you begin by asking what's working and what's working for those for whom it shouldn't be working. Now, what does that mean? To illustrate with an example, let's say you're interested in addressing the issue of teenage pregnancy, looking at it as a problem which needs to be addressed, because if a young woman becomes pregnant, she often drops out of high school, may not go to college, and then, of course, carries the burden of caring not just for herself, but her child. So in El Paso County, where I live, we asked a very simple question. The question was, are there young women who come from a Hispanic Latino background, who come from a poor socioeconomic status, because these are women who are at the highest of high risk for teenage pregnancy. So are there women who come from a Hispanic Latino background, who come from a poor socioeconomic status, who have a mother or a sister who have become pregnant when they were young, because that's another risk factor, but who for some reason are not pregnant? So you're looking for those who have solved the problem and who have solved the problem against all odds. So they are deviants because they are not the norm. The norm is if you have those characteristics, you're very likely to be pregnant, and they're positive because they've solved the problem.
Wow, that's very neat. So it's basically, you're finding the solution, and then you're learning how to integrate that into, the issue at hand to solve the issue?
True. You begin with the assumption that there's somebody out there within the community who has solved the problem. Awesome. And they have solved the problem when they shouldn't have, because they face the highest odds. And if indeed they have solved the problem, then the wisdom is right there in the community to solve the problem, as opposed to an expert from the outside coming and telling you, this is what you need to do.
So that's nice, and probably cost effective too.
It is cost effective because somebody already is doing it, and is doing it against all odds. And it's also sustainable because whatever solution they have found, they've made it work within the community.
Right.
Yeah.
So somebody has told me that you once wrote a letter to Mother Teresa.
That
and
is correct.
And she responded.
She did.
Can you tell me some more about that?
Certainly. Well, when you're 16 years old, you believe you can do anything. And so I was a teenager growing up in India, and I saw a television program which was on Mother Teresa. And it inspired me enough that I wrote a letter which was addressed to Mother Teresa, Calcutta, because I didn't know her address. I lived in New Delhi, the capital city, and she must have gotten the letter because in a few days there was a response, and my letter was a page long, but the response was 4 times longer, and that started a correspondence relationship between me and Mother Teresa, which lasted a long time, and which has made me in some ways a follower of Mother Teresa's life.
Yeah.
And I collect as a hobby stories about her.
That
which
is
are
so
inspiring.
neat.
Yeah.
Yeah. So would you mind sharing with me maybe what you wrote to her that first time?
I think I don't exactly remember what I wrote to her about, except to say that I'm inspired. I'm inspired by virtue of the portrayal of what she was doing. I think I may have said something about, I was really touched by how you care for the destitute, the dying, the unwanted. And it inspires me to do, as a city-bred young man, something which is too far away from my world. I'm inspired to do something similar. And her response, that I distinctly remember, said in the first letter that if you have written to me, there is something already in your heart which is speaking to you, and you may call it whatever you may wish. You can call it Jesus, you can call it Allah, you can call it Ishwar, you can call it whatever. If it continues to speak to you, I recommend that you go to the Home of the Dying, which is an institution which the Missionaries of Charity run in Delhi. And she said, try not to judge when you are there, and then you will know what to do next. Because too often, when you see poor people or the unwanted or the destitute and the ones who've been left on the street to die, and if you see them with a kind and a generous heart, with an open heart, then maybe there's something within you that begins to speak to you. And that's what happened.
Yeah, well, we can definitely see your inspiration of her through your work and all of the research that you've done. So that's really great that you were able to keep that correspondence going. So I think for our last question, I would like to know, out of all of the research that you've done, how would you suggest that we can integrate them into our daily lives, especially as young adults going into the professional world? How can we use the things that you've researched every day?
It's a very good question to ask, because as young people or as people, we like to ask questions, and too often we are obsessed as problem solvers in asking what's the problem, what's not working, what are the gaps, what are the deficits. And I think it behooves us, this positive deviance approach behooves us as a problem solver to ask what's working, and what's working against all odds. Because if you begin to ask what's working, then the answers will be very different than if you begin by asking what's not. So Mother Teresa, for instance, maybe if I could connect her with positive deviance, was once asked when she was in Washington, D.C., if she could march against the Vietnam War. And her response was, I'm so sorry, my child, I will not be marching against the Vietnam War, but if you choose to have a march in Washington for peace, I would be the first to lead. So, too many of us too often are against things because they are problems. We're against drug abuse, we are against racial discrimination, we are against teenage pregnancy, but we should also ask, what are we for? Because if you begin to ask, what are you for, then the answers may be different.
Right, because the tools to solve those problems are just right in front of us, right?
Indeed.
That is so great. Well, thank you so much for coming on to our show tonight and just visiting Campbell for this week. We really appreciate it, and we have learned so much from you even before you got here.
Delighted. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madison.